Good morning. Hope your Wednesday is off to a good start. Mine is so far. So, for this morning, I'm going to be continuing along my series of talking about, sticky, difficult theological questions. Along the way, I've looked at several things. Pardon me while I adjust this screen just a little. Among them, in our salvation, what is the relationship between faith and works? In our salvation, what is the relationship between God's power, God's election, and our own response to that? We considered the the two natures of Jesus, and last week looked at why it is that Jesus was crucified at all, as opposed to another means of capital punishment that the Romans used. And today, with Easter just past us and just after the events of Holy Week, something to look back on that. How could Jesus die? How could Jesus die? So one of the earliest challenges that opponents of the faith used was this reasoning. If Christ is God and Christ died, then God died. And it's a given that God cannot die, so therefore Christ is said to have died, therefore Christ cannot have died. So let me go back, read that again. So the premise, if Christ is God and Christ died, then God died. And if God cannot die and Christ is said to have died, therefore Christ cannot have died. Or you could put it this way, that if Christ is God and Christ died, then God died, so therefore either Christ isn't God or Christ didn't die. And either way, you have something that is a real issue for our faith. So what is the answer to that? What is the answer to that riddle? The simple and short answer is this, that what is God in Christ did not die, but what is man in him did die. This gets back to the two natures of Jesus. So that's the simple answer, that which was God in Christ did not die, that which was human in him did die. And there are two different things to mention to flesh this out. So we could say that Christ's human nature died. It was not part of the Godhead that died, but it was Christ's human nature that did. The human Son died, but the divine part of his nature did not die. And that gets us to the second thing. We remember that Jesus had two natures. He's fully God and fully human. And it was his flesh that died on the cross, but not his divinity. His divinity is not affected by the cross. This, of course, is related to what we've already been to before, this whole idea of how it is that the two natures of Christ are joined. So when he's on the cross, Matthew and Mark record Jesus crying out, quoting from Psalm 22, the Hebrew that I guess he would have spoken, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And in our Bibles, it's translated, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that cry is direct quote from the beginning of Psalm 22, a psalm of David. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? So was Jesus truly forsaken? Was he truly forsaken on the cross? Probably not. Probably not. And this is something that's so theoretical that we probably will never know the answer to, and ultimately the answer probably doesn't matter. One of the early church writers wrote that God's and man's natures were so completely joined in him that the union couldn't be destroyed by punishment or death. So perhaps that leads us in the right direction. Someone else wrote this: it was not he who was forsaken, either by the Father or by his own Godhead. You're the Christ, the Son of the living God, and Jesus says the Son of Man to be betrayed and crucified, and Peter scolds him. No, Jesus, that's not the way it's going to work. What is Jesus' response? Get thee behind me, Satan. In the garden, Jesus is praying, and Luke describes the prayer as Jesus, like he's sweating great drops of blood. And for certain, Satan was there in the garden whispering in his ear. And on the cross, probably the greatest temptation of Jesus' life, of his earthly life, was probably to come down. That was probably the greatest temptation of his earthly life. He could have. Yes, from a physical standpoint, he's a wreck, physically. But the divine power that was his from being the Son of God was not affected in the least. And that's probably the greatest temptation of his earthly life, of his mortal life. And that's one of the things that the onlookers used against him. They scoffed at him. They mocked him. If you really are the Son of God, come down. If you really are the Son of God, call for Elijah and let Elijah come and get you down. But he didn't. Like I said, that's probably the greatest temptation of his mortal life. But we know that he was obedient even to the point of death, even death on a cross. To quote from Philippians chapter 2, he is ultimately obedient and withstands the great temptation, which would have been to come on down, because he certainly could have. Obedient even to death on a cross. He's buried, and then 2 days later, he's crucified and buried on a Friday, and then on a Sunday morning, he rises from the tomb. Which leads to one last, interesting little point. I think I mentioned this in my sermon on Sunday. Who raised Jesus? And Jesus said in John's Gospel, I lay down my life and I have the authority to take it back up. I lay down my life, I have the authority to lay it down, and I have the authority to take it back up. That's Jesus' words. In the book of Acts, we have numerous times where it is said that God the Father raised Jesus from the dead, and Paul refers to that. And yet in Romans chapter 8, Paul refers to the Spirit raising Jesus from the dead. So which is it? And the answer is that Jesus' resurrection is a Trinitarian event. It is a Trinitarian event. All three persons of the Trinity, all three persons of the Godhead are involved in Jesus' resurrection, just as all three persons of the Godhead are involved in the initial creation as described in Genesis 1. in this we are saved. In this we are saved. That we who have abandoned God and forsaken God, and we who are alienated from God, that Christ represents us on the cross. And in representing us on the cross, he takes all of that so that he becomes alienated. He experiences what it is to be cut off. Christ in his humanity experiences what it is to be cut off. And that is the good news. That he who knew no sin became sin on our behalf, that we might become the righteousness of God. And that is the best news of all on a Wednesday morning. Have a great rest of your day.